Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Wednesday webinar. My name is Sydney Konahia, and I'm the Senior Coordinator of Membership with the IFA, and we have a great 16 minutes lined up for you this afternoon. Before we begin, I just wanted to touch on a couple things. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with the slide deck, will be made available later this evening on community.franchise.org. And if you have any questions for today's speakers, please add them to the chat or questions box, and they'll be addressed towards the end of the session. Today's topic is We Are Officially a Franchise, Now What? And it's brought to us by Benetrends Financial. Here to provide today's discussion are Eric Schachterman, CDO of Benetrends Financial, and Steve Biegelman, CEO of SMB Franchise Advisors. Thank you both for joining us today, and thank you again, Benetrends, for sponsoring the webinar. And I will now go ahead and turn things over to Steve and Nick to get us started.
Well, thank you, Sydney. Thank you to the IFA, and of course, thank you to everybody who's taking some time out of their busy schedules right now to attend today's webinar or listen to this recording. I know this is always a popular time of the year for travel and for getting things done as we get into this fourth quarter and budget time for next year. So cannot thank anybody enough that's even taken a few minutes to listen to today's educational webinar with the IFA. And with that topic, I am very fortunate to be joined by Steve Biegelman, as Sydney mentioned. As far as I'm concerned, there was nobody else to invite when it comes to a topic like this. I've known Steve since I came into franchising. I'm sure many of you know Steve as well. But Steve, before we jump into it, usually I just go right into things. But can, for the audience, give me a quick little snapshot of what SMB does, and specifically because of what today's topic is, it's pretty important as far as I'm concerned, and also your background and kind of you know how you fall into this and how your brain looks at a topic like this.
Happy to. Good afternoon, Eric, and thank you, Sydney, for the introduction. Appreciate the IFA sponsoring this event today with Benetrends. So a little bit about SMB Franchise Advisors. We're a franchise consulting firm. We help people franchise their business every day. We've worked with over 400 brands and helping them launch successfully into the franchise industry. Everything from working with their franchise attorneys on getting their franchise disclosure documents complete, making sure the startup costs, are what they should be, making sure the item 19 has everything in there that it needs so that, from a sales perspective, you have everything lined up correctly, the backgrounds of the company, all that stuff that needs to be included in the FDD is done the right way. So we work hand in hand with the franchise attorneys in getting that document complete. The rest of my team works on things like their franchise operations manual, which is the step-by-step process that a franchisee is going to follow when they become that first franchisee, the 5th, the 10th, the 15th, and the 20th. And then also, everything they need from their website to, their sales process, how are they going to sell and award franchises, their brochure. Everything that they really need to launch successfully into franchising. We've been doing this a long time, almost 12 years now since I started the company. And as I said, we've done work for over 400 brands. I have a lot of fun doing it. I've been in this industry, as Eric mentioned, a long time. Been doing this over 30 years. Hate to admit that sometimes, but it's been a lot of fun. Great industry for me. I love what I do, and it's a lot of fun. I write for Forbes.com. I sit on a whole bunch of boards. I do private equity transactions with our clients. So it's a lot of fun, but there's a lot of work from initially launching your brand into franchising to get to that private equity exit for our founders. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about, I think, today on our conversation in the next hour.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get to see all the way from entrance to exit, but that unique experience of spending a lot of that time in specifically what this topic is, watching them become a franchise and helping them become one. And then now what? What does that look like? And, listen, this could be 60 different 60-minute topics on all these different things. So, we're going to do our best. I always like to look at it as I like to bring the industry expert on to talk about the real core black and white areas. And I like to talk about the things nobody else likes to talk about, like, hey, what should we really do with development and lead gen. And I know what everyone says, but this is how we should do this. Or funding. Do you need a funding partner, or how or why? Events. What events should we go to? What should we expect from them? Making all those little things, because one thing that I guarantee any new franchisor is going to get, they're going to get a ton of advice from a lot of people. And sometimes that
Absolutely.
advice is more driven towards their purposes versus the franchise. So, really want to cover, we're going to go over some general areas of when you're franchising your business, what's the right way to do it? What are the things that are the core things that have to be done? What are some of the things that would be suggested, and what are some things to avoid? What are some of the biggest mistakes that even up front they might seem a little smaller, but some of the larger ramifications they'll have down the road? Sometimes these things aren't even feeling like they're mistakes initially, and kind of identifying what those are early on, and how those can have a sort of a penalty down the road if you don't have a plan for it. And then just some best practices, vendor relationships, development strategies, as I mentioned, shows, lead generation, all those different things there. So also knowing myself, knowing Steve, knowing this topic, knowing people's schedule, knowing that we're still not that far removed from COVID and Zoom land. I don't like to keep this too slide deck heavy. We're really going to have more talking and open conversation. If there are any questions, please feel free to type them in through the question box or the Q&A or the chat box throughout the webinar. And then, provided we have enough time, we'll tackle as many of those questions as possible as we get to the end here. So, obviously, coming from where somebody's just becoming a franchise, you're getting your systems in check, your processes, your training, building that manual, FDD, all of these different things. I have to give credit where credit's due. There's a franchise sales organization, Franchise Fastlane, and they kind of introduced me to these little words right here. What are the niceties and what are the necessities? What are the things that you absolutely have to have no matter what? And what are the things that be great to have and you'd like to do, but it doesn't have to be done, but it should be done. But I still think having a clear line of division between those two in all of these different categories is important. I probably see a lot of things from my end. That's where a lot of franchisors get tripped up, is they'll focus on the 50 niceties and almost ignore the 5 necessities. And it's like, well, if you just did these 4 or 5 things. But looking at manuals, discovery days, positions in the market, Steve, I know that just getting early on, going right to that day one, congratulations, you're a franchise. What are some of the things that you are your hot buttons, things that you focus on most with your brands, your clients, your experience? Is it just the manuals? Is it the FDD? Give kind of your perspective and experience, or maybe checklist of items people should be focused on that first quarter, first half year, first 12 months in.
Well, the first thing, obviously, Eric, is you need to have a franchise disclosure document. We'll only work with franchise attorneys. So, if you have an attorney who did your will but doesn't know anything about franchising, is going to try and put together your FDD, that's not somebody we would work with on a franchise disclosure document. So you want a franchise attorney who's going to help you put together the FDD the right way, and obviously work with, hopefully a top-notch franchise consulting firm that can help you every step of the way in making sure it has all the, the bells and whistles and everything you really need included in that to launch your franchise successfully. So FDD, most important thing, no doubt about it. And what's included in it, right? So what's the franchise fee? Are you selling through brokers? Are you using an FSO, like you mentioned Fastlane before, Brand One, Pinnacle, Raintree, whoever else is out there? There's a whole bunch of them that are great. So if you're using some of those and you're working with broker networks, you may have a higher franchise fee versus, you don't want to have a $20,000 franchise fee and try and go into the broker networks because it's just not enough there for everybody. So, those are all things that you're going to have to, figure out up front. Territory size is a huge thing that you have to make the right decisions on. I can't tell you how many brands come to me after the fact, didn't know we existed as a consulting firm, and says, can you look at my FDD? And we do. And I say, why did you give such a large territory out? And he said, I don't know, just kind of thought that made sense, right? So, I mean, making those decisions are really, really important early on. The good news, if you're an emerging brand and you just launch and you only have a couple franchises and you want to change things, you could do that, right? So, we've launched brands who said, oh my gosh, we absolutely have to give a 10-mile protected territory. And then a year in said, what were we thinking? I mean, we said, well, we know we had the conversation that that's way too big for your particular retail brand, right? So, and we'll help our clients through that. But you definitely need an FDD. You need all the key elements included in that. Then you also need the franchise operations manual, right? So that is not a nice to have, but it's a necessity, right? It's that blueprint that a franchisee is going to follow, your system, your process, and your procedures. And a lot of times that's not easy to create. And for a lot of founders, they have a lot of that information right here. It's in their head, but it's not written down on paper. It's not put in, in a software system. So we have to get that from their head and from their team's mind and, written down or typed into a system, a software system that the franchisees can access. So that is a long process. It takes time. And if you are a legal franchise today and you do not have an operations manual, you need to get one as soon as possible. And, having a boilerplate operations manual is really not a good idea. Okay, it really needs to be detailed and catered to your concept. Because if there is ever an issue with the franchisees, you're going to go back to that operations manual. You're going to go back to the franchise disclosure document and compare things to those documents and what the requirements were. And if you don't document it, you're going to have a hard time if you have a problem with that franchisee and you eventually end up, even if it's not a legal issue, even if it's just an issue where we're going back and forth on a debate with a franchisee about certain procedures, and they say, well, you never taught me that, or you never talked about that before. Well, we want to say it's in section 4.2, page 38 of your operations plan, whatever it may be. So those are, key critical components of your franchise brand. Certainly you want to have your website, right? It's great that you have a consumer website up for your customers, but you need a franchise website, right? So you need a site that franchise candidates can go to. What's the first thing that a candidate's going to do today about any brand? They're going to Google it, they're going to research it, and they're going to go to your website. When I started in this industry over 30 years ago, again, I'm aging myself, that didn't happen. It just didn't. But today, that's what happens all the time. So you want to make sure that that stuff is up to date, it looks great, because it's the first impression that somebody's going to get about your brand if they don't know of your brand. If they're loyal customers of your brand already, they may already have experienced lots of great things about your brand. But if you get introduced through a broker network or an FSO, or just going to a trade show regionally in a market and people hadn't heard of your brand, the first thing they're going to do is go to your website and Google you on social media and take a look at everything. And if that doesn't look good and is not up to date, it's game over. So it's really, really important. Discovery days, absolutely, right? You need to be ready for the candidates. It's great when you say I'm legal and I have an FDD, and we say congratulations all the time to our clients when they launch into franchising and they get their FDD and now they're ready to talk to candidates. But it's kind of like inviting somebody into your home, right? So you're not going to invite them into your home for dinner if your house is a mess, right? Or most people wouldn't, right? So you certainly don't want to do that, right? So it's the same thing with a discovery day. Okay, and that's the term that we all like to use now in franchising. It has been for a long time. So if candidates are coming in, you want to make sure your home office looks great, your corporate office team is ready, and they're engaging. Because look, you're spending a lot of money in either lead generation or some sort of way in marketing to get those candidates to be interested in your brand. And then they come in from out of town and they're excited about your concept. And then if the team is kind of lackluster and the office kind of looks sloppy and the corporate office is a mess and your corporate location that you're touring them through doesn't look good, Well, do you think people are going to want to buy that brand? And you've spent all that money to get them to that point. FDD, not just the marketing. It was the FDD, it was the operations manual, it was everything else with franchising. So, make sure you're ready for the discovery day to bring those candidates in. And there are companies now that are even doing virtual discovery days, Eric, during COVID. That was a
Oh
big thing
yeah,
that
absolutely,
came out.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Even winding the clock back a little bit before we even on, because there's so many, like we said before, so many areas we can go in. But even going from that beginning, I always like to have people know they should be doing. But from my end, I'm sure from your end, we see a lot of the mistakes. You were talking about the territories.
yeah.
What are some of like maybe the 3 or 4, shouldn't have done this, or aha moments that you've seen that kind of happen right in that first quarter, first 6 months as it relates to either, I mean, you mentioned not having the operations manual or having one, but it's not really a manual, it's just a check the box item. But what are the ones that, would be, okay, yeah, that makes sense? Or are there any ones that just don't always pop out, but people realize? I think the territory one is brilliant, and very important for people to understand. I think too many people are afraid to say no to anything early on. A candidate says, well, I want to add these 20 zip codes. And by adding those, you took those away from a territory that almost isn't a good territory without those zip codes. So now no one's going to buy that one. They bought this one. And then they run out of geography. They don't have enough franchisees down the road. Or sometimes they really, I know one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen early on, whether it's setting up the franchise or down the road, but coming from the funding side, it's too many licenses awarded to one individual early on. I just can't imagine a new franchise should sell 10 licenses to a new franchisee. I mean, at that point, they would end up owning more locations than you do or ever operated. And, it's a
Yeah.
very interesting thing. But those are some of the ones that I've seen that just kind of give you pause, but you see that franchise fee check and all those items. So I want to pick your brain there. And the one last one that I will mention, you talked about the franchise fee. And candidly, whether going internal sales, internal development, FSO, broker networks, web portals, shows, whatever, I still am enamored with the idea of I want to make my franchise fee as low as it can be to attract more buyers. And I've seen people, and I just said, somebody that will likely buy your business at a $20,000 franchise fee is likely going to buy it at 40. And what you realistically did is you just had people that would now be interested that can't afford your franchise. So those are some things I've seen. But anything that in the last whether last 10 years or last 10 months that just kind of bubbled up and just be like, oh man, they just keep forgetting to think about this.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on a couple things you said first. Absolutely on the franchise fee. We had a brand we launched into franchising that tried doing it organically and had a franchise fee of 25,000. Didn't really award any franchises in the first couple years. We pivoted strategy. We, set up with an FSO. We got into the broker networks. Their concept was a little bit unique. Raised the franchise fee to 40 some odd $1,000. And I remember the founders saying, nobody bought my franchise at $25,000. Why are they going to buy it at 40 or 45,000? And next thing you know, over the next year and a half, they sold 55 franchises in 120 territories. So, that kind of backs up your point a little bit, right? It's all positioning and making sure you're with the right people. And, not every, broker group wants to sell every franchise brand, and not every FSO wants to take every franchisor. So you just got to be the right fit and the right match. But in a lot of cases, it's about positioning of the brand. That's really, really important. So, and getting back to one of your other points about selling a lot of territory to somebody early on, that is a mistake that some emerging brands make. And sometimes what happens is that 10-unit franchisee that buys early becomes stronger than you as a franchisor early on. And I've seen a couple cases where that franchisee ends up taking over the company. So, as a founder, of a concept, and I think a lot of the brands on this webinar are founders and emerging brands. You got to be careful of that, right? You don't want one of your franchisees to become too strong, where they become more powerful than you. So that's a little bit of a challenge. But another thing that we see happen a lot is bringing on the wrong franchise partners early on. So it is tough to say no when you're an emerging brand. I get it. You've just spent a lot of money, paying attorneys, consultants like us, every accountants, all the vendor partners to become a franchise. And now you have somebody holding $40,000 franchise fee in front of you and is going to spend $200,000 to open your brand in their particular market. But maybe they don't share the same values as you. Maybe they don't share the same culture. Maybe they don't really care about, the people in your concept. They're only in it for making money. We had a brand, I won't say which brand it was, but early on, had somebody walk in, and it was a very expensive concept, over $1 million. And somebody came into the discovery day, and at the end of discovery day said, "I'm ready to go. I can't wait to do this. But by the way, it was a kid concept." And they said, "Just want to let you know, I just don't like kids. I'm only in this to make money." And the founder called me up because it was very early on. He said, "What do I do?" And I said, "You turn them down, because everything that we've spent time working together on over the last year is, everything you do is about your vision, your mission, and your values of your company. And this person doesn't signify and care anything about those. And you'll thank me in the long run." And of course, now the brand grew to hundreds of units and sold to private equity and did quite well. And he said it was one of the best decisions he ever made. But probably when he called me, when he hung up the phone, he was pretty pissed at me for telling him that. And he'll tell you that. So, and it's not easy. It's real easy. I founded my own franchise company when I was 21 years old, and I grew it to 35 franchises by the time I was 24. And there were people that I should have turned down that I didn't early on. So I made those mistakes too. But that's a tough decision for an emerging brand, to say no to people. But you have to do that sometimes. And in the long run, you'll be happy, but it's a tough decision for an emerging brand. So that's a mistake that we see a lot. A brand, is based in the Northeast, let's say, where we are, Eric, you and I are based, and their first candidate wants to go open in California or Arizona. And I would say, well, how are we going to support that franchisee? "Oh, they'll be fine. They were a customer and now they moved out there." Okay. That may be okay to do with your 50th franchisee, maybe even your 20th franchisee, but probably not your first, right? So do we have the distribution set up for your product? How are you going to support them? Do you have to go and visit them every month, or can you do it virtually? In some concepts you can do, a franchise that far, but if it's a brick and mortar concept, we typically wouldn't let our clients do something like that early on, because that's a huge mistake. I understand they love your concept, and when we're ready to go to Arizona, we'll give you a call. But right now, we're just not ready. And again, tough to say no, easy for me to say, but it's the right decision in the long run. If you want to build a brand that one day you can have a partial or a full exit to private equity, or you're building value and wealth for future generations and your family to take over the business, you got to do it the right way. And I take a lot of pride in my career of 30 plus years doing that. And I think it's really, really important. Bring on the right franchisees for your concept who share the same vision. They become brand ambassadors for your concept, Eric, and you want them out there, raving about your brand that you're a part of and that they're a part of.
Yeah, it's such a great point. It's one area is, when we look at the niceties and the necessities, is it a necessity to only sell within geographic area of where you're located? No, it's not a necessity. I always like to say to people, rather than why it's good, I will say is, I know a lot of good brands that if I ask them how did they do it, that's the answer. And I don't know if I've met any brands that did it the other way that I'm still talking to.
Yeah, and it depends, right? I mean, if somebody, if a brand has a really strong infrastructure and they have a bunch of corporate units and they, sign up with an FSO right away, and they can scale nationally, and they're funded well, that could be a different story. But for a lot of these emerging brands that are just starting out, that are self-funded and not well capitalized, that's a huge mistake. Huge mistake to do.
And another area that you had mentioned is when we talk about growing and how many to grow. I've always heard different versions of this. I wonder if this is something that's come up, is that for every franchisee added, I need X amount of internal people to support them. As you smirk, it sounds like that's something that I feel like that formula gets thrown around franchising quite often, and the number changes a lot. And I'm not going to ask you to lock yourself into one, but I think that's also an area people forget, is that as you grow, right now you can support this many franchisees. At some point, you need to have bodies that support that. What has your experience been there?
Yeah, initially you're going to support your first few franchisees with your internal team, right? When we launch an emerging brand, it could be, the people working in your daycare facility who helps, teach the kids, and now they become a part-time trainer and help you train the new franchisees, and then eventually become a regional manager, and we'll teach them the franchising elements of, support. It could be, people in your, technician business. It could be people in your handyman business. But initially, it's going to be your internal team that's going to help you with those first couple franchisees. It could be your food concept that you launch into franchising, and guess what? Your operations manager or your general manager, they're going to help train that first franchisee. Guess who's going to open that first franchisee? Probably your general manager and you. But eventually, you are going to bring people onto your team that will help those franchisees as you continue to grow. For brick and mortar concepts, you tend to need a little bit more staff as you grow versus mobile concepts. A lot of home service brands are really hot franchising today, these mobile concepts. And you could tend to support more of them virtually than having to go there and check up on, the food establishment every single month with an operations person. I spent a long time of my career at Rita's Italian Ice, and we'd go visit every franchisee every month when I was there while they were open. So one of our operations people had to physically go into every location every single month. Now, times have changed a little bit now, and the strategies may be different, but that's what we did. And we had 350 operating stores and about 40 corporate employees, to give you an idea. When you kind of come back to the ratios. And I don't mind saying, every brand's different, but typically you hear the terms, one employee for every 8 to 10 franchises. That's typically what you're seeing out there and you're hearing. Now that includes everybody, right? So that includes your accounting department, that includes everybody. So, some brands, if you do a lot of the paperwork and you do a lot of the billing for your franchises, they may have bigger accounting teams. You may have 6, 7 people in accounting. And that counts towards that support. It's not just field support people, it's also development people. A lot of brands, we've talked about FSOs a little bit, they outsource to a franchise sales organization. So they don't need the internal franchise sales team internally. They may need somebody to still work with them, but they don't have as big a franchise sales department as some other franchise companies who do it internally. But for a lot of emerging brands, I think what typically happens is they try and outsource as much as they can early on, because you just can't afford the big infrastructure early on. But you will add infrastructure to your franchise company as you scale with franchisees. You just have to be prepared for that.
No, absolutely. And, I would say this, for anyone that's listening on the line, most likely you've already become that franchise. And that's why we're here today, is I'm a franchise, now what? As Steve mentioned, and as I always like to remind people, if there's things you're hearing right now that weren't identified or thought of before, don't just say, okay, well, we missed that, it's too late. There's no such thing. And I think the reason I bring that up is we hear a lot of these things, and there's probably, as we mentioned, topic on top of topic on top of topic. I think just sitting down, this doesn't have to be an FDD, this doesn't have to be goals or plans or anything else, but having just a little internal idea written down that says, here's how many we'd like to sell within the first 12 months. Here's what type of person we're looking for. These are kind of the niceties. Like, this is what would be nice, and we can kind of bend a little on these. But you gotta start somewhere. And I think that when we see franchise brands that are like, okay, I'm a franchise, and whatever comes at me, I'm gonna deal with. I'm a firm believer is what you put out there in the universe, you'll get back. So if you start saying, here's what we're looking for, here's where we want to go, here's where we want to grow, here's what type of relationships we want to have, it's amazing. That's what you'll start developing. If you play well, whoever's interested, we'll see if they're a good fit then, or we'll see if this area is good, or we'll see if this, it often doesn't work out. And my favorite line that I've ever heard when it comes to a lot of areas of life and business, but specifically with the audience for this topic, is sometimes you've got to slow down so you can go faster. And if you think about that, is if I slow down and make sure my manuals are up to date, my discovery days are dialed in, I have vendor relationships, I have my lead gen and friend development process set in kind of the direction I want, at least for the next 6 months, who's going to do it, where we want to go. We've got different options that we'll talk about here. If I slow down and do that, once that's in place, you can hit the accelerator, and then you don't have to slow down then. I think if you go fast without those things, you'll stop. Wait, let's do this. You'll go fast, you'll stop. And if anybody ever watches races or anything else, sometimes that person that keeps their spot in the race long enough and then towards the end has the resources to just keep their foot on the accelerator is the one that goes around the track faster. The one that has to keep taking the pit stop that started off fast never wins the race. So there's a lot of these different areas, and obviously I want to make sure we cover all of them. But yeah, that's just something that I've seen a lot. Anything, Steve, before we kind of get into a little bit more on lead gen, friend dev, vendor, funding, and growth?
Yeah, one piece of advice that I want to make sure that we cover, and I tell this to all of our emerging brands, a lot of times people will ask me the question, Steve, what's the difference between your successful emerging brands and the emerging brands that just don't go anywhere in franchising? What's the difference between the ones that do that private equity exit and get to enjoy the rest of their lives and maybe still roll some equity in for the second round and all that other great stuff? And one of the big things is that they fully understand that they're in a whole new business. And for everybody that's attending this webinar, they need to understand that now they're in the franchising business. They're no longer just in the pizza business or the dry cleaning business or the handyman business, but they're in the franchising business. And Eric, I know you've been a road warrior the past 4 weeks, and you've been everywhere under the sun. And there are a lot of great franchise events, whether they're franchise shows, whether they're conferences, whatever they may be. There's great information obviously online and webinars, just like we're doing right now. But you have to be willing to fully engage that you're in a whole new business. And our clients that do that are the ones that grow. Our clients that sit in their office and wait for things to happen and don't attend the conferences and don't go to the trade shows and don't go to learn are the ones that struggle. So you have to be willing to do those things. Now, you're also going to get tons of advice, right? Not just from me and Eric, but from everybody else. And, sometimes your head's spinning and you're like, okay, that person from, this big brand told me I should do this. Well, that big brand has 30,000 locations. Well, okay, they have a different budget than you do when you have 2, right? So of course they told you to do that. So, go to the people that you trust. A lot of our clients have board of advisors to get set up early on and help give them direction and guidance. And I set out a whole bunch of boards for our clients. I mean, it's important that you get good advice early on. Not just from your consultants or your financing partners, but from others. But you got to understand you're in a whole new business, and we can invite you to events, and Eric can invite you to events, and the show companies can invite you to events. But if you don't go and attend them, you don't go to learn, you're going to struggle to grow as a franchise brand. I mean, that's where you build the relationships that I've built over 30 years, and Eric, that you've built over all the years you've been in franchising. It's by attending all these events. And maybe you don't want to attend as many as Eric has the last 4 weeks because he's been on the road all the time, but you do need to attend some, right? So I think that's really, really important.
I always, I know the CEO at Benetrends, Rocco Fiorentino, one of his lines he always tells brands is, don't give up at the 50-yard line. And you see too many brands, and it's funny when you see brands that do that, Stephen. When I mean, this is almost specifically with like events. We see it all the time. Well, I went to the IFA convention last year, and I didn't get any leads from
I didn't get anything out of it.
I did the franchise expo in this town.
Yep.
I didn't close a deal from it. And as much as we always take the tack, yeah, but you gotta, one day somebody just completely flipped it. So imagine I'm a franchisee, I just bought your system, and I said a year into it, I tried, it didn't work. Are you gonna say, yep, you're right? No, you gotta stick with this, we're gonna get there. If you just apply the same logic you want your franchisees to have to all of these other things, you don't have to worry about anybody else selling. I will tell you that there's not many things in our industry that have longevity that eventually don't work for the mass of people. There's a reason there are still franchise shows. There's a reason that there's marketing companies but it's not the same effect everywhere. It's not the same time, but the only thing that's consistent, it won't work right away.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and the same thing doesn't work for every brand, right? There are some brands that sell organically, and we have brands that don't work with any of the referral partners or broker networks, and sell and have awarded franchises and have hundreds of locations that have done great. And we have other brands that only sell through the broker networks and the referral partners. So, it's not one size fits all. As you mentioned, trade shows, whether it's National Event Management, MFV, whatever trade shows there are out there, FCC has trade shows. I mean, whatever the trade shows are, they're great. So that's one vehicle. It could be, Ads an Entrepreneur. It could be the Wall Street Journal. It could be anything. There's so many, resources out there for you to promote your brand. You just have to figure out what's right for you. And sometimes it's a lot of trial and error, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will say this, if you've heard people talking about this with life habits, with life changes, with business. Pick a core and say, this is what I'm going to go with, and give it a real run. I know there's about, just in my experience, sometimes people go, well, I'm going to go do these things, and I do 15 different things for 1 year and see what works, versus saying, I'm going to do 5 things for 3 years and see how those go. And if they work, you keep them. If they don't, put it to the side and start other ones. I think sometimes we also try to, I know it's tricky because when you're just getting started, but I've always heard that saying, do I want to be a mile wide and an inch deep? Or do I want to be an inch wide and a mile deep? Do I want to go all in on one very specific target? Like, I'm going to go trade shows and that's where I'm going to go, and I go all in. Hey, that's great, but you've got to stick to it. Yeah. Or do you kind of plant all the seeds? But what you don't want to do is the mishmash effect. Like, I want to go a mile wide and a mile deep. Like, it's not going to work that way. So
well, and that happens with emerging brands, right? So they'll start with some of the broker networks, and there's so many great ones, that are out there. But then they'll also do trade shows, but they'll also do social media, and they'll also do. And then, you ask them, how many leads did you get last month? And they say 30, and you say, where'd they come from? And they say, I don't know. Well, that's a problem, right? So one of the things, getting back to some of the key important things that you got to do, right, is track where your leads are coming from. Track what's working, right? It's all about metrics, right? So we need to know what works to be able to know what we should continue with. Some of it is just getting your brand out there, especially as an emerging brand. You want to get your brand out there. You want to get people talking about you. And just like you said, you attend the one trade show and people saw your brand and they're like, that thing was kind of neat. I like that concept. Then they see it again the next year. Then they see it at the IFA convention. Then they see it, leadership, whatever it is. And they're like, I remember meeting Eric. He was a really good guy. I really like that concept. Maybe I should do business with that Benetrends. And even though we didn't do something together at the first possible time we met, the relationship has evolved. And that is what I could tell you about franchising is it takes time. It's a marathon, not a sprint. I tell people that, okay, you got to be in it for the long haul. And if you are, and you work at it, this is a great industry to be in to typically grow, most brands.
Yep. Well, now we get to also see some of the good process in place and stuff that maybe falls a bit more in my wheelhouse of what I see, and that obviously relates to the funding. And it's always been fascinating to me the place that funding has with established brands, emerging brands, everything else. Steve, you see it. You work with so many emerging brands. You introduce them to Benetrends. Well, they have a call with us. It's like, well, we might not need that right now. And I mean, obviously, I'm a little bit biased towards. I'm like, you actually might not need anything else but this right now, because if the candidate can't afford it or can't get finance, or hey, it's great that they can just cut you a check in cash, but should they? Is that setting them up for the right success? When you built your numbers and your financial requirements, did you consult with a funding company to say, what's the liquid capital required? What should be the net worth? Whether they're a funding coming out, we do that all the time. But yeah, just a couple things that we've seen. But the funding has always been fascinating. You meet a brand and it's like, oh, so where do you get your vehicles from? Oh, we have a vendor for that. And where do you do this? We have a vendor. Where do you get your uniforms from? We have this. Who does your funding? I don't know. We don't need that. It's just like, and of all of them, any of the funding partners out there will tell you, 99% of the time, to work with a funding company to provide options for your candidates, they get paid by the franchisee if they get them funding. The franchisor pays the funding company nothing. So it's a vendor that doesn't cost you anything, but it's still just fascinating that that gets pushed to the side. But more than the partner is at least whether you have one or not. Like you said on the lead gen, and see where someone says, well, I don't know where those leads came from. I look at some FTDs, I'm like, where did those liquid capital and net worth requirements come from? I don't know. We copied it from another website.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done topics on this with the IFA before. I have my own little, call it my Shecky math on. I've always been fascinated that brands still use flat numbers of you need 40,000 this. Use percentages. I mean, what's stopping somebody from saying you need to have 40% of the liquid capital, 40% of the total project cost,
Total investment, yeah.
Of the total investment for a single. If it's going to be a multi-unit deal, we want 2 times the franchise fees in liquid, whether you would see it or not. But so many people, we're talking about the sales, and it's no one's thinking about how is that candidate number 2, you're kind of going to open number 2, 3, and 4. And by the way, if they used all their liquid for 1 and they have to get a loan for number 2, they have nothing to put down towards that. So yeah, it's all the funding. Having a funding partner is not just like, okay, I have somebody to send it to. It's helping you map out, what do I need to think of right now that I'm not, so I don't have all these sold not opens, because that'll crush a emerging brand faster than anything.
Yeah, it will. And, snows are obviously a big deal, especially for brick and mortar concepts. It's great to have a whole bunch of snows, but you don't want to have too many, right? Because that, as you said, can crush you. But, having a relationship, whether it's with a funding partner, whether it's with a payroll company, whether it's with, technology, I mean, all these things, you need to be set up when you're an emerging franchisor. You don't think it's important initially. You just want to go out there and sell, and you just want to get leads, and you want to close deals. And that's all great. But as you said, Eric, if that lead says, okay, it's a $500,000 investment and I have $20,000 to invest, they're probably not going to qualify unless they have a whole lot of other assets that they can borrow against. But, Benetrends will help you with that by putting a calculator on your website and make you look like you're a much bigger company and franchisor than you are initially when you're starting out. And they'll help you with this whole process. And then, you didn't even get into the 401k rollover concept of what Benetrends offers, but that's an incredible, program that's out there for candidates to access funds, and they get them pretty quickly, I think, right, Eric? If they fund through a 401k rollover?
Yeah, most people that pursue that option will often see funding in like 12 to 15 business days.
Yeah, I mean, as a franchisor, I would love that, to find out that my candidate's going to get funded. And I've had situations where for some of our brands, the candidate used the 401k rollover for their down payment. So if their down payment was $300,000, they used the rollover to put their down payment down because the total investment was $2 million, let's say, in this particular concept. So, having all of this set up for your candidates is really important, because what's going to happen if you don't, and you get a serious candidate and they go to their local bank says they have one location. What do you know about the concept? Well, I don't know. I'm just kind of excited about it. It's going to be tough to get funding, and you want to build that relationship so that long term you have that partner in your corner, just like you do, like I said, for food. If you're a food concept, just like you do, an architectural firm, and, just like you do for payroll, all these things. It's really important that you set up as an emerging brand early on. You don't think you need it, but you definitely do.
Yeah, and I think most times people think that they don't need it because, and Steve, maybe you can confirm or deny this. I don't know why it is this way. Maybe there's more data behind it, but I feel like emerging stores, their typical first 4 or 5, it's like they cut a check, they paid cash, they didn't need funding. Okay, but are you just trying to grow to 5 franchisees? No, I want to get to 20. Then why are you managing your funding relationships off of what your first 5 did? What you need to be thinking about, what can I do for this one that number 20 and 50 are also going to need? And just because you haven't need, one of my favorite lines ever, sometimes you don't know what you need until you need it.
Very true.
And sometimes it's too late, but even little things, Steve, you talked about it. The day and age from almost anything, but specifically in this one. And if you're an emerging brand I took your business and I walked into my local bank where I do my personal banking and say, hey, I'm about to buy this concept. Give me a loan for it. I'll tell you how that plays out.
Yeah. And listen, there are thousands of franchise brands out there, everybody.
Yep.
Thousands. So, if I'm interested in your concept and you don't have a relationship, whether it's with a vendor partner for financing or anything else set up, and it's not impressive, guess where I'm going? I'm going to look at the next brand, okay? Because there are thousands of opportunities out there. So, you're competing with big brands. You're competing with big brands that are certainly established, but then you're also competing with other emerging brands. And, the way we operate, we want all our clients to be part of a family, and we think that's really important. And when they share ideas, and we have in-person networking events, because we're believers in that. Now, people aren't sharing their trade secrets, but at the same time, they're trying to help each other grow. But at the same time, everybody competes for franchise candidates, not necessarily directly all the time, but there's a lot of brands out there.
Yeah.
And if your brand doesn't show well, they're going elsewhere.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples is, guy goes into the car dealership, says, I want to buy that car. Dealer says, great, go to the bank and figure out how you're going to finance it, and I'll get it ready. And on the way to the bank, he stops at the Ford dealership, and they have Ford Motor Credit internally, and they qualify him there, and he drives off from the parking lot with that car right there. So it's all these little things, and you know what? Listen, funding partners are great. We're a preferred funding partner for the IFA. We love what we do, but there's a lot of things that a brand can do internally. The amount of times I've said to a brand that's already kind of started to grow and has 20, 30 franchisees, and I asked them, have you ever asked what banks did their loans? I bet within those 20 or 30 franchisees, 10 were done by the same bank. Well, what if you knew that? And I, as the franchise, called up the bank and said, hey, you're already doing 10 of these things for us. Can I send you more? Do you have that appetite? Can that be? I mean, that's something we do a lot, is we match brands to banks. Some banks like to get all in on a brand and commit to it. Steve, I know we've seen that with some of your concepts where a bank says, okay, we've looked at it, we've done a few, we'd like to do a lot more, and we're going to earmark this, and we don't have to look at the business model anymore. We're good to go. Having that business plan kind of created, there's companies out there that will create a business plan for your candidates to use, and knowing those demographics. That's something that we've been able to do since acquiring the group over at DCV. But all of these different things, they do have an impact. You mentioned it before, Steve. I mean, the people over at FranData, the franchise registry, the franchise directory, having some information that's run there. Because when you're an emerging brand, I will tell you this. On the funding side or on the bank side for lending, your story is amazing. Your initial numbers as a business and corporate owned stores is amazing. As a franchise, you're there not to mess up the deal. There's nothing about your business that is going to make that bank say, oh, I just want to do this. So you have to do these little things. FranData does things like the fund score, the franchise credit score, getting on the directory. I know everybody gets on that spot that says, well, I'm already on the SBA directory. The directory is what the government needs you to be on to say that if you want an SBA loan, you're set up in the proper way. The registry is what the lenders use to say, well, I know that they can get a loan, but should I give them a loan? What looks good? What doesn't look good? So there's all these little twists and tools that, listen, go and pick 4 or 5 things and say, I need to know how many I want to do here, how much I want to do here, what vendor relationships I want to have in place, and say, these are the things I'm going to stick to for the next 18 months and then see what happens. But these are these little things where I think everybody gets in these emerging brands that Steve and I have seen over and over and over again. And when we see the hits and the misses, I bet if Steve and I sit down privately and we make a list of all of the issues with one or the good with the other, they're probably all the same in different areas over a length of time. So I want to provide some time for, to any other things that Steve, that you'd like to dive in on. And obviously if there's any other questions from the audience, but Steve, any kind of parting thoughts here?
Yeah, I think, as an emerging brand, as I've said a few times, you got to be all in. You spend a lot of money to franchise your business. You're super excited about it. The future is franchising as you grow. Not to say you can't open more corporate units, you certainly can. But if franchising is the future direction of your company or one of the major growth vehicles for you, you got to be all in into the business and attend the franchise conferences, the franchise shows, go to seminars, go to the IFA convention, attend these webinars. There's the regional franchise business networking events. There's all different types of conferences that you could be a part of. The industry is very welcoming. So you want to really get out there and understand what's out there and what you can learn and take away from it, and make sure that you're the best you can be, right? I know it's kind of probably a little cliche at times, but be the best you can be when you have candidates coming in. You're spending a lot of money to franchise your business. Make sure you're putting your best foot forward for those candidates when they're coming in. Make sure you provide great support. I mean, we didn't talk a lot about that, but once you're a franchise and you award those franchisees, especially the first few, you got to make sure they're successful. Okay, I understand it's their responsibility to locally market their business typically and grow their business. It absolutely is. But if they're struggling, guess what? You're not going to keep awarding franchises because it's going to affect validation. So you need those first few franchisees to become successful in order to keep growing your brand. So support is really, really key after you're successful in awarding those first few franchisees.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about all these things left and right. If there's no validation, the unit economics aren't there. It doesn't matter if you've got 50 banks and all these other things and systems and manuals, it's not going to work. And I will tell you this, if you don't have those things, but you have good unit economics and good validation, it doesn't, but usually you don't have those things unless you had this up front. So it's kind of that chicken or the egg, which kind of keeps our industry fun. Probably a good area to wrap up there. All I would tell is anybody, take advantage of, we've always said in that crazy world of franchising, why is it great to buy a franchise? You're in business for yourself, but not by yourself. I hope anyone on the line or that's listening today realizes that applies to franchise brands as well. You're not a franchise buyer's, you're a franchise by yourself, but you have a ton of industry experts and other franchise brands and the IFA and all these different connections to help you. Some will give you more advice, some will give you less, some will give you more that's not good, some will give you one piece of information that turns to be pure gold. But thank you everyone for joining us. Steve, I don't know if we were just so awesome that no questions came through, or if people's heads were exploding because between my rambling and slides kind of confuse them. Either way, I will take it as a win. Again, thank you so much to the IFA for all that they do for our industry, for any of the franchise brands that are on here that are not members, that are not contributing. We are all part of one industry. We have to protect that shield of franchising. And that is always going to be almost more important than anything else that we do, because they protect what we're trying to all build. So again, thank you so much, Sydney, for the opportunity to host today. I know you mentioned this will be recording. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure I'll see you somewhere soon.
Absolutely, Eric. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the IFA and Sydney. If anybody has any questions, they probably can find a way to reach out to you or me directly. Eric, there may be a way to give them access. There's our emails right there. Feel free to email me. Feel free to email Eric. We're always happy to answer questions. But thanks for having me today. And Eric, I am sure I will see you soon.
Thank you guys so much for your time today, and thank you everyone for attending. As Eric pointed out, this was recorded, so it'll be uploaded to community.franchise.org this evening. And if anybody wants a copy of the slide deck, that'll also be there, but you can shoot me an email. I dropped my email in the chat box and I can send that to you directly. But thank you both so much. This was a great webinar, and thank you to Benetrends for sponsoring, and I will hopefully see both of you soon.